you very much.
So, welcome again, Marta.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. As the free words translator in residence, I work mainly with translation from the Polish because that is my own background. But not only that, I also deal with translation in general, and not only translation, but also literature and its power of changing the world, which is hopefully what we're here to do tonight. And to talk about the voices of women in translation and in international literature, three fantastic guests have accepted my invitation. Ursula Phillips, Bibi Bakare-Yusuf, and Deborah Smith. Do join in, excuse me, at any point of the discussion. If you feel like you have a question, there will be a dedicated time to ask questions at the end of the event. We also have a hashtag if you're tweeting. It's hashtag #FewWomen. So do please use that if you'd like. You can also use Read Women or Women in Translation, whichever you prefer. Here we go. Ursula Phillips is a writer on Polish literature and translator of literary and scholarly works. A major aim of hers is to introduce works by Polish female writers of the 19th and 20th centuries to a non-Polish readership. Thank you, Ursula. Both academic and general. These include Zofia Naukowska-Szuka's, which was written in 1927, and which received the Found in Translation Award in 2015. Her translation of Naukowska's Boundary, written in 1935, likewise published by the Northern Illinois University Press, will appear this year. Parts of her translations of contemporary author Agnieszka Taborska appeared in online journals, including Asymptote. Bibi Bakare-Yusuf is co-founder and publishing director of Cassava Republic Press. Her life's work is to contribute to the transformation of the African world through the production of alternative narratives and knowledge. She has worked as a gender and research consultant in the public, private, and development sectors. A feminist and independent scholar, she recently co-founded Tapestry Consulting, a boutique research and training company focused on gender, sexuality, and transformational issues in Nigeria. She has a PhD in Women and Gender Studies from the University of Warwick. And Deborah Smith has translated several Korean works, including 2 novels by Han Kang, the Man Booker International long-listed The Vegetarian, yay! And Human Acts, and 2 by Bae Sua, The Essayist's Desk and The Low Hills of Seoul, both publishing this year. Deborah recently founded Tilted Axis.
Yes.
We made a book.
We made an actual book.
Which prints actual books, and is a non-for-profit press publishing on contemporary literary fiction. Tilted Axis' first titles will include a darkly erotic Bengali novella, an obliquely allegorical take on South Korea's social minorities, and a feminist environmentalist narrative poem from Indonesia, published as a sight-impaired, accessible art book. These will be followed by translation from Thai, Uzbek, and Japanese. So as a little treat to us, I have asked all 3 of these marvelous women to read out a short excerpt of a text that maybe they published, or maybe they translated, or maybe not, but something that in some way informs or inspires their practice. So maybe I'll go the other way around. So let's start with Deborah.
Reading a bit from an actual real-life book, which is, as Marta said, the first book that I'm publishing with Tilted Axis. It is, the title is Panti. It's by an author called Sangeeta Bandyopadhyay, and it has been translated from the Bengali by Arunava Sinha. And it is a series of very short, disconnected chapters, so it really doesn't matter from where I read from. In the middle of an afternoon when a terrible loo was blowing, and without any thought or consideration, she'd boarded a ramshackle bus. It wasn't exactly crowded, but most of the seats were occupied. She found one that was empty and sat down. Only then did she notice that there were no other women on the bus. When she also realized that the other passengers all followed a particular religion, something which was apparent from their clothes, beards, shoes, even the rings on their fingers. She was overcome by an unwanted fear. She felt a numbing sensation sweep through her entire body like pins and needles. She tried to steal a glance at her co-passengers, all men, but fear had blinded her, preventing her from making out their individual features. And the visible signs of this religion, which each seemed compelled to display on their person, began to deeply disturb the humanism she'd maintained all these years. Assailed by feelings of insecurity, she sat ramrod straight despite the swaying of the bus. When she turned to look out of the window, a shriek slipped out before she had time to clamp her hand over her mouth. It wasn't just the bus. The entire street seemed to have been engulfed by this other faith. The architecture of the houses, the names of the shops, the array and origins of the products on sale, the men, women, and children, prayers, all of it sent a single throbbing signal into every crevice of her consciousness, a broadcast from another religion. The bus and the street it was travelling down became a separate world, pushing her deeper into the darkness. The blood in her veins had been quickened by the knowledge that she was the sole representative of her faith on this bus, much more than by her being the sole woman. Was her religion then a stronger and more primal factor than her womanhood? She'd had no religion, and yet, in stark contrast to the ease with which objects slipped from her hand, or relationships from her life, this religion hadn't fallen by the wayside. While riding the bus, religion felt as natural as her body's nervous reflexes. The bus arrived at a place where everything had changed again. The street name, the shop signs, the religious symbols on women's bodies, the religious practitioner seated beneath a tree, the desire for religion as expressed in food, the search for it in people's expressions. Averting her eyes from the sight of a dog urinating on a broken clay idol, the embodiment of woman worshipped in her own religion, she discovered her fearsome and fear-prone wariness vanishing and found herself once more able to ignore her religion. Back in her flat, she considered telling you that secularism is not a credo but a shifting situation, eternally mutable.
Thank you. Bibi? Sorry, can you also say?
I'm going to read from Audre Lorde's Poetry is Not a Luxury. The quality of light by which we scrutinize our lives has direct bearing upon the product which we live and upon the changes which we hope to bring about through those lives. It is within this light that we form those ideas by which we pursue our magic and make it realized. This is poetry as illumination, for it is through poetry that we give name to those ideas which are until the poem nameless and formless, about to be birthed but already felt. That distillation of experience from which true poetry springs births thought as dream births concept, as feelings births ideas, as knowledge births precedes understanding. As we learn to bear the intimacy of scrutiny and to flourish, those fears which rule our lives and form our silences begin to lose their control over us. For each of us, as women, there's a dark place within where hidden and growing our true spirit rises, beautiful and tough as chestnut, against our nightmare of weakness and impotence. These places of possibility within ourselves are dark because they're ancient and hidden. They have survived and grown strong through that darkness. Within these deep places, each one of us holds an incredible reserve of creativity and power, of unexamined and unrecorded emotion and feeling. The woman's place of power within each of us is neither white nor surface. It is dark, it is ancient, and it is deep. For women, then, poetry is not a luxury. It is a vital necessity of our existence. It forms the quality of the light within which we predicate our hopes and dreams toward survival and change. First made into language, then into idea, then into more tangible action. Poetry is the way we help give name to the nameless so it can be thought. The farthest horizons of our hopes and fears are carved from the rock experiences of our daily lives. As they become known to and accepted by us, our feelings and the honest exploration of them become sanctuaries and spawning grounds for the most radical and daring ideas. They become a safe house for that difference so necessary to change and the conceptualization of any meaningful action. Right now, I could name at least 10 ideas I would have found intolerable or incomprehensible and frightening, except as they came after dreams and poems. This is not idle fantasy, but a disciplined attention to the true meaning of "it feels right to me." We can train ourselves to respect our feelings and to transpose them into a language so they can be shared. And where that language does not yet exist, it is our poetry which helps to fashion it. Poetry is not only dream and vision, it is a skeleton architecture of our lives. It lays the foundation for a future change, a bridge across our fears of what has never been before. Thank you.
Ursula?
I'm going to read a passage from my forthcoming translation of Zofia Nałkowska's Boundary. This was a book which was very well known and studied in Polish school curriculum, and it won a lot of prizes when it came out. So it's quite a well-known book, and it's never appeared in English before. And the passage I've chosen illustrates a theme which seems to run through the book and in a lot of women's writing, at least in Polish in the 30s, the connection between the body and the psyche. That night had been a bad one for Justyna, full of dreams and sudden awakenings, damp and sticky from sweat. What's the matter with me, she thought, and sank back into sleep. She had to get inside somewhere, reach some sort of people, some kind of dwelling place. Down an unpleasant black corridor with her head bowed and a feeling of suffocation in her throat. It was a passageway like the one leading to Yasha's basement. The very same, yet worse and more terrifying than it actually was. She was walking along this corridor, on and on, until she stumbled upon a wooden door made only of bare planks. She groped with her fingers over the surface for a lock with an iron latch and a key jutting out of the lock. She turned the key because it had been locked from the outside and opened the door. No one was inside. No one responded. She entered the dark interior and felt with her hand for the bed. There were no covers, only boards. On the bare boards, directly on the wood itself, lay her mother, just as she had after she had died. Fully clothed, swollen, in her black dress, holding a little crucifix in her hands. It was as if she had been lying there for a long time, as if they had forgotten to bury her, and that too was worse than the truth that her mother had died. Only at daybreak did she dream about the child. Tiny, completely naked, healthy and robust. It was alive, but as though hewn out of white stone, not flesh. Pretty and sunny. Then it became soft, flopped in her arms, its little head hung on its neck and rolled onto her shoulder. It grew sad, like little Jadwisza, and then when it died, it actually was Jadwisza. She awoke from her dream weeping. In the room it was still dark and cold. She remained in bed and, as she lay there, continued to weep silently for a long time. It may have seemed that she dreamed of Jadwisza, but it was not for her that she wept. Jadwisza had lived in the world and seen the sky and earth before she went blind, played with the cat, exchanged hugs with her mother. But that child of hers, which was to be and was no more, was poorer by far. She had gone to the midwife and of her own accord allowed the thing to be done to her that women do. And so it was she who had squandered its life. Most of all, she remembered, and it kept coming back to her, how when she was lying on the bed at night after those pains, keeping quiet so as not to wake anyone, she was suddenly in motion. And then it had slipped out of her like a little mouse. The whole world hadn't wanted it. Its own natural father hadn't wanted it. Only inside her had it had a safe hiding place. She lay in bed until midday and thought round and round in circles about the same thing. On the far side of the yard, the sun was shining on the pales of the fence. Outside the window, a single small tree was writhing in the wind and scraping its branches against the pales. The snow was melting. The March sky was a clear blue from the wind and dotted with dark azure cloudlets. Yet Justina had no desire to get up, or eat, or go out. She felt happy only when lying down like that, weeping and thinking of the one thing.
Thank you. Well, that's a very diverse and varied start, I thought. Thank you so much. I wanted to start by asking about the women that you translate, about the women that you publish, and I wanted to kind of go back to the source. Who are they? Who are those women? Do you know how they write? Do you know why they write, and in what circumstances? Anyone? Bibi?
Why do the women write?
The women that you publish.
Yeah.
I think for me it's different between the women that I translate and those that I publish, because I translate from Korean, and it seems possibly uniquely that the Korean literary scene is female-centric. There are more women who make the shortlists for the prestigious prizes year on year. There are therefore also more women who have been awarded these prizes. And there doesn't really seem to be any particular gender disparity or bias. The idea of having a prize specifically for female authors would be seen as bizarre or outmoded. Whereas the women I publish so far signed from India, Bengali, from South Korea again, from Indonesia, from Japan recently as well. And so it's very different between the countries. Japan and South Korea are a little bit similar. But then, so for instance, in the case of Sangeeta Bandyopadhyay, who writes in Bengali, lived in Kolkata, has very recently moved to London. She was a writer who I probably would not necessarily have discovered if I hadn't been actively looking for female writers writing in regional Indian languages. I had to be actually looking that specifically, even though that isn't necessarily specifically, because so much of what you would just automatically hear of, or what makes it out of the subcontinent, is in English and is more likely to be by men. Actually, there isn't so much of a disparity in what's written in English, but then if you look specifically at regional languages, it's a much wider split. It will be something like 90% male and 10% female. So it's really, I mean, I can't really talk about why they write or how they write in that sense, but in terms of how I have come to them, it's been a change from sort of translating almost only women accidentally, because they were just there, and I didn't need to think about it, to realizing that each country, each language within the country, especially if you're talking about somewhere like India, will have a very different dynamic, and you need to be aware of what may be stopping writing by women from getting heard.
I think that's, yeah.
I can't really say why the women write, but what I can say is why I publish women, and that's really interesting for me. And it stems from my interest in archive. I'm really interested in archive and the making of archive and how archive gets made. And I thought to myself, if somebody opens the archive in 200 years of African world literature, what are they going to find? And I thought, okay, the archive from the 1960s onward of African literature, the archive they would see would be men, predominantly. And so I wanted to be involved in the creation of the archive now for 200 years' time. And that archive, I wanted it to have a lot of women in the archive. I also felt that when we look into the archive in 200 years' time, I wanted to see not just women, but diverse sexualities as well in African world. I want to see that, and that's going to be reflected more and more in some of the acquisitions that we're making. So I'm very interested in disrupting the 20th century of African men of letters, as important as they are, to locate women within African letters. So that's what's motivated. So my motivation is the motivation of archive, and my motivation for doing what I do is really thinking about the future and how we look at the past.
So it's kind of, you want to co-create the legacy.
I want to co-create. It's not even co-create. Co-creating is being really generous. I want to create it. I want to. And the writers are the facilitators. I'm facilitating. They're helping me to do my mission, basically. So I have an agenda, and they're fitting into that agenda, and it's a very, very deliberate and purposeful agenda. It's really about thinking about the context, about the text, the content, as well as the craft. All of them meshed together. It's what I want to create. And I also don't want a situation whereby somebody will look in 200 years' time and say, okay, you were a publisher, and yet what you did was to regurgitate the old narrative, the masters. You haven't really contributed. And I think insofar as the 19th century novel form was in many ways quite male, and for as long as publishers, especially in the West, continue to propagate that narrative, I don't think they're disrupting anything particularly.
Okay. Are you disrupting, Ursula?
Well, I hope so, but I'm glad you introduced those words, mission and agenda, because I definitely translate with an agenda and a mission. Although I don't only translate women, I have translated men, and I don't only do fiction, I do academic books as well. But, I come from this primarily as a scholar. This is where I started from. And, every time I've studied a European language and looked at the literature, we have never studied women, or we have studied very few women. So this is my basic starting point. Many years ago, I did a degree in Russian. We read Akhmatova's Requiem, and we read a few poems by Tsvetaeva, but apart from that, we didn't read any women. I studied German literature at the same time. We didn't read a single woman in German. And then when I later studied Polish, and I did another degree, we studied one woman, a 19th century woman, who writes very patriotic novels, and that's the only woman. So, Orzeszkowa, Eliza Orzeszkowa. I mean, she's a very good writer, but of course we read her patriotic stuff. We didn't read most of her novels, which were actually very much about women's emancipation and about Jews. those were not on the curriculum, and which, you know, you were asking me before about the canon, and I think, you know, this is, you know, my intention is to broaden it, yeah, to include many more women writers and make them available. Now, I must say that the 3 writers that I have so far published, 2 19th century writers and Zofia Narkowska, who's an interwar writer, or she was important in the first half of the whole of the first half of the 20th century. These were not obscure women writers, you know, that I've excavated, you know, for some kind of feminist purpose. They were actually well-known writers in their own day, and it's quite interesting, you know, the mechanisms by which they then get forgotten and written out of the so-called canon and the works that we study. Now, why translations are so important, it's that in, you know, most American universities now and in Britain, when Slavic languages are studied, they tend to be studied together. Yeah, so you don't just do Polish or you Czech or Russian, you tend to do them all. And therefore, you know, a lot of teachers require good translations in order to include a writer. And also, you know, given all the cutbacks in higher education and the cutbacks in Slavic studies, amongst others, the comparative dimension is also very important. And so it's in that context that translations are also important. I mean, just to give you one example, one of my earlier translations by Maria Wittemberska, I translated a novel by her, which is in some ways very similar to Clarissa. That was one of the models. It's a epistolatory novel. It was originally published in 1816. This has found its way onto a comparative literature course at the University of Glasgow, where it's being studied, you know, in translation, alongside translations from Italian works, French works, German works, yeah? So, you know, this is what I'm trying to do with this particular strand of translation that I do, is to bring these very, very good writers to a much wider audience. Now, I've been talking about the academic sphere, because, I mean, this is where I come from, and this is what has initially inspired me, but these are eminently readable books. They were not written for the academics to, you know, dissect. They were written for people to enjoy. Yeah. So, you know, my hope is that, you know, people that enjoy reading good literature, because, you know, the bottom line for me is that they have to be a good text, you know, whether they're by a man or a woman. Yeah.
I think that notion of the canon and of the archive, of what we leave behind, seems to be, you know, kind of one that people react to and that motivates them to kind of create something that is going to be, you know, a new perspective, something that's going to be something that's going to provide a fresh voice. And that notion of the canon, I think. Last year at the Translation in the Margin events, Mina Kandasamy spoke about this. I know you were there. And she spoke of the fact that a female translator needs to confront the fact that a book translated by a man or written by a man is much more likely to be introduced in a canon than a book that might be about the same thing but written by a woman. So this issue of this canon and of you know, making canons of your own, is this something that you want to do? Kind of.
Well, I would like to get away with the whole idea of canon. Yeah. You know, that there is a select, you know, range of literature which is somehow better, and the ones that we should study. Because, I mean, who decides that? You know, who decides that? Who's constructed that? And who's perpetuating it? You know, this is what I'm saying, you know, about what we studied in the past. I mean, now I think things are changing, and I have proof of that on the basis of my own translations and other, other translations that have been done from Polish that have found their way onto courses. And, you know, I can name the universities if you like. There's Michigan and Toronto and several others, where the people who've been teaching have welcomed the existence of these women, because it means they can now add them to their courses. So they can broaden...
But it doesn't... what you're saying is by studying them, it's not disrupt. It's not saying do away with the canon. It's almost like recreating several new canons, including more people, expanding the canon, so to speak. You know, by you're introducing Polish writers or other language groups into the canon. That's what you're saying. So because you are contesting the idea of who creates canon. The reality is, for me, when I think about, I used to wrestle with the idea of canon and wanting to do away with it. And now I've come to a realization and an acceptance that each generation, each genre is going to have its own canonical figure or figures. And where do I want to place myself and how do I want to insert the kinds of canon, what do I want the canon to look like? Do I want them to have a particular shape? Do I want them to continue to be a particular gender, a particular race? You know, I'm really interested in how we expand the canon, how we disrupt it, and maybe in 300-400 years' time, we will not be talking about Salman Rushdie, let's say, or Martin Amis. We'll be talking about Helena Oyemi or somebody like that, or Sarah Ladepomanika or other people. We'll be talking about Adrian Rich. We'll be talking, you know, so these are ways in which we can think about the canon.
I think, by publishing them or by translating them, you just give them the space. You just allow them to...
But publishing, I think publishing them is not enough. It's important, but we have to have lots of people who are going to help in that canon formation. And the people who create canons are scholars. Scholars, critics, reviewers, and people who confer awards. So we need to have more women, more people from ethnic minorities, different language groups, to populate those symbolic structures that are forming the canons.
Great. Yeah. Deborah, any input?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I don't know if I would quite consider it canon, but you know, the idea of an establishment, or the idea even with translation of just what gets through, you know, it's particularly with Tilted Axis focusing on Asian languages, that automatically means you're focusing on underrepresented or lesser known languages in English. And that will mean that there will have been, you know, a tiny amount of works will be available already. And the problem with that is that you get stereotypes, which is sort of compounded by publishing being a conservative business, which means if one thing does well, people want to publish something that's very similar to it. And so you end up with, you know, one particular kind of narrative with particular types of characters written in a particular style, you know, representing India, you know. And that's another problem then with, say, Indian writing in English is seen as Indian writing. It's somehow representing this entire subcontinent. Whereas if you look at regional languages, you know, you see that difference and you see it as something positive and specific, and suddenly you're getting all these narratives which are not conforming to the one narrow bit of the spectrum that you'd had access to before. And part of that is to do with publishing women who are often marginalized in certain literatures because the establishment is, as a translator from Malayalam, I read an article by her recently, and she said that translating women from regional languages was important and necessary because it was an escape route from overwhelming and overbearing patriarchies that continue to shape what literature is and can be in those languages. But it's also about, you know, how gender intersects with other things, so race, class, language, just seeing it as part of a spectrum and as part of something that you're going to because you want something different, you know, just because you don't want to read the same dull and, you know, sometimes damagingly cliched books.
I think that what you mentioned about stereotypes, I think people frequently come to translated literature, I feel, maybe feeling like or literature from other countries, that they will, you know, they almost treat it as a guide. Oh, I'm going to learn something about Poland.
Ethnography.
Yeah.
It's
So, I mean, what's your view on that?
Well, I'm interested in the literature. That is the main thing. I mean, I'm not translating Polish literature to say something about Poland particularly. I mean, the books that I've translated are, you know, novels of a European, you know, background. They come out of a lot of European texts. They respond to them. They deal with human issues, philosophical, political issues that were important at the day, and they just happen to be written in Polish. And the barrier to you understanding them is the language. It's not so much the content. I mean, obviously any literature comes from a particular background, so you're going to have, you know, specific cultural context. Obviously, you can't escape that. So I'm not making a plea for universalism, but on the other hand, you know, it's value as literature. That you know, a book has to be a good book as far as I'm concerned. I'm not translating just because somebody is a woman that I'm translating them. Yeah, there has to be, you know, a much stronger case for it, I think. You know?
I think that with publishing, we often say we're not doing something because of we're not going to be publishing her because she's a woman. But the reality is many dross are published just because they're men. And there's it's an unconscious move where you publish. It's a very tacit way of being where you publish what is familiar to you. We then say, because it's familiar, we think, oh, it's good. And for me, no, you're not saying, you're not saying that at all. What I'm saying in terms of the publishing landscape, you know, I'm interested in a very deliberate way, publishing books about and from the African world, first and foremost. And accept that all literature is located, is localized, it's coming from a place. There's no such thing as universality. There's a myth of universality. And I want to contest that. You know, when you have a section in bookshop that says Indian literature, African literature, and what have you, and a lot of people have problems with that. I don't. One of my favorite bookshops in the absolute world is in New York, McNally Jackson, and I love the shop because you go in there and you're like, okay, I'm interested in American literature, and you're there. Japanese, you're there. It allows me to decide at any given moment that I just want to focus on Japan this year. I want to focus on Nigeria. I mean, the only thing I don't like about the fact is you have Africa. I'd rather they have, reducing Africa to a country. So I'd rather you have Japan, British, Nigeria, Zimbabwean, have those sections because it helps us to narrow our options, right? Yeah. And it's a way of guiding us through countries. However, you asked a question about people using literature as a kind of almost ethnographical inroad into a society. I think whether we like it or not, we read to travel to other places. However, I want the literature to be good. It has to be well crafted, first and foremost. But I want to read a piece because it allows me to enter the world that is unfamiliar to me, to make the world is a vast place. I want it to come to my bedroom. I want it to come to me without having to get on the plane and contributing to environmental degradation and stuff. And literature allows me to do that in a very condensed and tight way. So I arrived in New York in my 30s, and I felt I knew my way around New York because I had read James Baldwin. And I just felt, okay, I mean, of course, there was a familiarity just because I've been to New York in literature before I even arrived there. You know, so I think we mustn't shy away from the fact that literature opens us up into a world. And sometimes it can be ethnographic and voyeuristic. And it's so, and I think it's okay. We all of us as human beings, we're nosy. You know, we tend to associate that with women, but all of us, we want to enter into worlds and into cultures that are not familiar to us. So you read Russian novels, they're unfamiliar. You go to Dickens' England, you're thinking, what kind of a world is this? Right? It's a strange world, but yet we enter that world because there's something that it allows us to enlarge our own world as well.
Yeah. Did you have anything to say?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both what Ursula and Bibi said, and it's really the issue is that literature from certain countries, languages, and also by women is far more likely to be viewed as anthropology or as ethnographic without the artistry being considered as well, even if it is great writing. You know, the idea of the kinds of questions that male authors get asked in interviews, the kinds of panels that they're invited onto at festivals, and, you know, seeing time and again, say, a Muslim woman who has written a novel being put on the panel about being a Muslim woman and being asked that instead of being asked about the book she has written, which is not necessarily about being a Muslim woman, or maybe about, you know, many other things as well. So, yeah, I suppose it's not that you want to shy away from the idea of translation being a window onto another culture, even though that is a horribly hackneyed phrase, just because, yeah, you do recognize that that is a large reason that people might pick up a book from a certain country, and it would be maybe a bit sneering or condescending to sort of judge somebody negatively for having read something for that impulse. But as a publisher, I think there is still hopefully a lot you can do around, yes, which books you choose to publish in the first place, but also how you market them and, you know, how you try and get people to talk about them and position them, and maybe things that you don't ask your authors to do, or things that you encourage them, on the other hand, to get involved with if there is an opportunity.
I wanted to ask you, Bibi, about Ankara Press.
Oh, the romance.
Can you say something about
Yes, we, 3 years ago, we started a romance imprint called Ankara Press in Nigeria. And the idea behind Ankara Press was to give African women, for African women to see themselves in the context of romance fiction. Because many Africans, men and women, because men actually read a lot of Mills and Boon and Harlequin and stuff. And I felt there must be a cultural dissonance where every time your model of romance is white women, men on horses, and stuff. It must be quite confusing. And what would it mean to see yourself reflected? Because I think there's a certain confidence that gets built up when you see yourself in the things you consume. And I think that whether we like it or not, part of the superiority of whiteness, of Europeanness, is the fact that everything that's around that they see, that they consume, they see themselves reflected, whether it's in Hollywood, in music, on TV and stuff. So I felt with Ankara, let's have African women at the center, falling madly and crazily in love with African men or vice versa, and also to have the women be professional, they're doing something, they're not just waiting for a man to come to them. They are going after their own desire, their own quest. They're not waiting for anyone. And to have the men to be as a model of masculinity to have a more gentle masculinity rather than an oppressive masculinity, which I think a generation of women all over the world have been conditioned to see men who are forceful, who take over your life as the model for relationships. So we wanted the kind of romance we're producing to have women and men who are wholesome, they have healthy relationships, and they do crazy things. And when the people are in love, love makes people crazy. And so for Africans to acknowledge that we love, and we love madly and badly as well. And because often when we think of Africans, we tend to see Africans as this dark continent with disease, with corruption, and people are living their lives. People are having sex. They are thinking about the next sex toys and how they're going to be aroused. They're thinking of fashion, and they're thinking of all kinds of things, as well as some of the difficulties of life. And I wanted a literature that would reflect the diversity. But also because people's entry into African literature tends to be literary fiction. And I really wanted to expand our ideas of literature coming out of Africa. That we have genre literature, people do romance, speculative fiction, crime fiction, to really broaden that.
So I think in a way there is this kind of relationship between a book and the country of origin, let's say, maybe to a certain extent, providing a fuller picture of a particular country, maybe a fuller picture of a particular culture at the time when it was created. Obviously it's impossible to speak about a text that expresses, a language, but all of those, every single book that we publish, every single text that we translate adds to, the richness of the voices that are out there that can, form the new canon. About kind of not sitting around and waiting until something happens to you. I wanted to ask, I'm not sure how many of you were here for the Berlitz Festival, which took place recently. During the Literature as Liberation panel, there was this a lot of panelists said that what really resonates with them is this idea of kind of writing, and by extension, publishing and translating things that they feel need to be out there, voices that need to be amplified, without necessarily planning how you're going to publish them, who's going to pay for it, and and kind of with having quite an idealistic impulse, as a point of origin. So I was wondering if this chimes with your views. Obviously, none of us are in translation or in publishing to make a huge mountain of money. But would you say that you kind of prioritize working with texts that you feel are necessary as opposed to texts that you feel, will sell?
Well, from my point of view, yes, definitely. I've had a career in something else. I've not full-time literary translator. And I do, fully understand the situation that a lot of translators are in, and they need to accept what they're offered, and they need to earn money, and publishers need to sell books. I mean, I fully understand all that. But with this particular stream of translations that I'm doing, and I have some other things, ongoing at the moment, is entirely idealistic. And, I feel that, you were saying about, the window into a different, into another country and, what's going on at a particular period. I mean, I tend to do, at the moment anyway, women that lived in the past, in the early 20th century or, even in the 19th century. And they provide a very different window onto what we understand of the politics of that region. I'm talking obviously from the point of view of Poland, but there's a certain historical narrative that is repeated, and it's the one that we're always taught. And then when sort of government that's been elected in Poland is talked about in the media, these stereotypes refeed into this constantly. Whereas when you read the works of Zofia Nałkowska, you could read them as a critique of the Polish interwar state, for example. And I recently gave a lecture about this, and it's not the only thing she writes about, because she's a very diverse writer. But yes, this gives a completely different perspective on how the state was perceived, from the great glorification that you get, from the way we're sometimes taught about it. It is idealism, and I feel that, when people ask me about this, I think, if you want to translate particular books, well, just get on with it, do it. Because this is the only way that you're going to get them out there, because nobody's going to ever come to me and say, well, would you like to translate interwar Polish women? I have to, well, actually, somebody has approached me about a novel published in 1966, which I'm now working on. But, that was, I think, beside the point, maybe, I don't know. But maybe, after you've done several, people realise that maybe there is some sense in this, and then present you with something else. But, so, I do the books. I then, look for publishers. I look for grants. I've been very lucky in that I've managed to, for at least 3 of these, had some form of grant. It hasn't covered all the costs. I have eventually managed to find a publisher for these translations. Yeah, so yes, I feel, if you feel it's important, you get out there and do it.
Yeah. Yeah, because those voices, in order to be amplified, have to be there in the first place, right? That book needs to be published. That book needs to be translated.
But yeah, and I suppose you were asking me, or one thing we thought we might talk about is how feminism, expresses itself. Well, if you're interested in the fact that women have been discriminated against by by publishers, by critics, by scholars, then this is a way of getting them back onto the getting them back into visibility. But it's taken many years of actually knowledge and building up my own knowledge of this culture in order to be able to decide which ones are important. Yeah, because you can't just pick out a few women from a bibliography. You have to really know something about the whole history of the culture and be able to place them somewhere, I think. So, there's a lot that goes into this.
So it's not for years and for not much money.
Yeah, I think,
right.
Well, I think you asked a question about idealism versus money. And for me, publishing, we're for profit, so money, business decision is there. But first and foremost, it's the idealism. And why I say that is because I think there's a publisher, as publishers, we are victim of our own success. We overpublish. There's too many books out there. And I think, in a way, we need to reduce the number of books we publish. We need to reduce and really focus and push what we want to, the few books. So when I decide I'm going to publish a book, so for example, this book, Like a Meal Bringing Ice Cream to the Sun, is coming out in April. When I decide to publish a book, I think first and foremost, do I like it? Is it going to fit into my projection of the archive into the future, right? I don't think about the people now. They're going to buy it because they're going to help me to create that future. Is this book going to contribute to that? And am I in love? I've got to be in love with the book. And sometimes a book, I might be in love with the book and I don't think it might necessarily make money, but I think to myself, it doesn't matter. What matters is people don't know what they want. They don't know what they want, so I am going to help them find what they want. I'm going to create a desire that they don't know that they have or they need. And my decision, this book, is going to be one of the desires that they're going to gravitate towards, and I'm going to create that. So basically, I think my idealism, somebody must pay for it.
That's a fantastic publishing strategy. I think this is great. Does that resonate?
Oh, it does resonate. Yeah, we are non-for-profit, so it resonates in the sense that my idealism, it would be lovely if somebody else was paying for it. Realistically, it's probably my non-existent vast sources of wealth that will be paying for some of it. But no, I mean, it's very similar in that, yes, it's idealism in the sense that it's writing that I love and that I'm excited by. And yes, they're not necessarily the kinds of books that a commercial publisher would be falling over themselves to sign. Although luckily, because nobody is practically looking in these markets at all, they're not hearing about them anyway. So that does mean that actually, we're able to sign authors who are, some of the bigger authors in their country. They're the ones who have won big prizes and that are sort of household names. But also just to sort of to contest this idea of, there is a certain kind of book that will sell and that there is a certain kind of book that will not sell. Yes, if you're a massive commercial publisher, then you kind of you have overheads, you have certain things that you need to cover, and it's easier to publish a certain type of book and sort of let it sell itself in a way. But, what we're hoping to do by only publishing 5 books a year is to make them sell, to put in the time and the effort and as much money as we have to market them properly, intelligently, enthusiastically. And, from the translations that I've worked with, it really doesn't seem that there is a difficulty in getting people excited about a book that you are genuinely excited about yourself, and that you're willing to, put that kind of effort into. There's no type of book that just will not sell, unless it's, just not a good book, and then you would be publishing it anyway.
Well, let's hear it for people who find their desires in the books that we want to show them. I wanted to, maybe one last question. There has been such, I feel, an increase of voices in the debate about women in publishing, women in the business of publishing, women in translation, women in reviewing, women in awards, literary awards. I feel like this conversation is gathering steam, and we've been talking about Kamila Shamsi's idea of publishing only women. There's all the hashtags on Twitter. There's a lot of activism going on in the internet, and I was wondering if there is something that you feel we could be doing differently or better to kind of make an impact on the literary landscape, whether there's something that you find problematic about the discussions that are going on. What do you think about this kind of activism and the increased spotlight on the issue? Can we make it better?
I think 2 things. One is that it's great to see a lot of attention and people talking about it, but the need to make sure that it's not a one-off thing, that it's not a gimmick, that this isn't the woman year, and then we have the diversity year, and then we have another year, and it just sort of falls away like that. And then the other thing is also to just maybe as part of that to broaden the conversation of to not have it be about tokenism or a certain kind of writer or writing that we are focusing on this time around, which I think enables people to kind of misread it as some kind of worthy cause that you're going for, when in fact I think it should be really more about recognizing the barriers and the biases that are there, that are ensuring that what is published overall is actually a very narrow spectrum in a lot of ways. And so if you were to sort of concentrate more on removing them and then just sort of, so improving accessibility, inclusivity, that kind of thing, it just seems like that would be, I don't know, more balanced overall, I suppose.
And would maybe allow it to be a more long-term situation.
Yeah.
If we just kind of make it into a... What do you think about this, the fact that we should maybe actually stop making it an issue? Maybe it should be, maybe... What do we think about a woman's literary translation award?
Well, I'm quite in favour of it, actually, because I think, it's, I don't know, always a bit torn over this because, for me, feminism expresses itself in bringing women, onto the same level, being regarded on exactly the same level. I'm not wanting to promote women to the exclusion of men, and indeed, all the books that I've translated, they definitely promote certain aspects of female experience, which is not often discussed or not discussed at all in a lot of male writing. But at the same time, there are men in these books. All of them are written with very, what I call mobile sort of narrators that look at things from different perspectives. And in all the books that I've translated, there are quite important male protagonists as well. So they're not books by women, just about women. And I'm very, as a scholar as well, very wary of this term, women writers, because I think it in itself is ghettoizing, and that's what I really don't want. But on the other hand, if we don't keep talking about discrimination, then these things just get forgotten again. So I mean, I think we have, in the same way as in the 80s, 90s, we had to go through that period of what I call archaeology, where we were discovering women writers, and all these histories that came out: French women's writers, German women writers, Scandinavian women writers of various sorts. We had to go through that in order to restore knowledge of what had been forgotten, yeah? But I think, we've perhaps got beyond that stage now. But, my fear is that still when, even with the work that I've done and the reception of it, I still often feel that people don't actually think it's that important, It's just Ursula or feminists digging up these people to somehow show that there were some women writing in the 1930s. They don't actually really regard them as important or as important as male writers, and they are. You only have to read them to realise that. So I'm in favour of a woman's award for a woman's translation of a woman writer. Yes.
I think I'm in favour as well, simply because they highlight the persistence of patriarchy within publishing, that publishing and the creation of literature is not immune from the wider structures in society. And so what these awards remind us, as well as celebrating, they're also a reminder of the work that still needs to be done, right? So whether it's to do with women, awards for women, or awards specifically for Black people or LGBT people, I think there should be a wake-up call to say, there's something not right here, there's an imbalance, there's a problem.
There's something missing.
There's something missing, and is this the kind of society we want to continue to live with, to live? And if we're not happy with it, then we need to change it to where we get to the Korean level, where you have more women, right? So that it will be absurd to have an award specifically for women. We are not at that stage yet. You know, it's something like the Bailey's Award, Translation Award for Women, draws attention to these issues that we need to do something about it. We need to change, because most of the people who are reading, who are buying these novels, are mostly women, right?
That's true.
They're mostly women. So what is it about the gatekeepers of publishing that continues to give prominence to male writers? As Cassava Republic, we publish men as well. We do publish men. But when I publish men, I'm interested in how, if they're going to talk about men, how masculinity is portrayed. I'm not interested in necessarily you reworking and regurgitating the old tired masculinity. You must be able to do something differently with how you're portraying gender relations in the text. Similarly, I'm not particularly interested, as a reader, interested in a kind of victim narrative. You know, I'm interested in, yes, everyday life, existential experience of women and men and stuff, but I want to see people going through a journey, right? I think our daily life is full of pain and anguish, and I also want to see laughter, I want to see joy. You know, so when I look at a book like this, for example, it's a book about a 75-year-old woman. We don't often in African literature talk about aging women, right? And for me, when this manuscript came to me, it was something I'd never really thought about. Right? I never really, you know, and of course, all of us have to deal with aging. There's such a veneration of youth, of the youthful body. And then here you encounter a 75-year-old woman who has more energy than me and who is just full of life. And suddenly you're thinking, 75-year-old thinking about sex, having masturbated. You don't associate that with the aging body, especially the aging African body, right? That kind of text is exciting to me. Whether it's going to sell in a context where people want to read African literature in terms of issues, right? It's a different, I'm interested in somebody who just inside themselves, inside their bodies, and takes us on a journey that I haven't thought about. I want text that will allow me to think about things I haven't really thought about. And when I think of a book like a mule bringing ice cream to the sun, I just love the title, right? Bibi, you've got to confront your mortality. Because what happens to all of us is we are inside our youthful body, and we never think of aging. And so reading a text like this makes me think, a 75-year-old woman thinking about having a tattoo? Come on, get real, right? But there's something alive about encountering such a text. So I think that our world is such a rich world, the world we live in. We are mixing with all kinds of people. London is an amazing city to encounter diversity of all sorts. Why are we not seeing that represented in the body of literature? And I want to be able to contribute to that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. There's so many stories waiting to be told. And to help you think about how to do that, I'm going to now allow you to ask questions. If we have a microphone, and if you have a question, please wait for the microphone, because if you speak without the microphone, it's not going to get recorded. So please wait for the microphone.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. That's really interesting. I have a question for Bibi. You mentioned this romance list that you're starting. How do you find the books? Are you commissioning them, or are they books that are already out there? How have you put that list together?
We send out a call for submissions, and I think for a lot of Africans, I'm sure most Nigerians in particular think they can write. We are so kind of arrogant and overconfident. We think we can do everything. We think we can go to the moon. So we are not short of manuscripts. So people are constantly sending us stories from across the continent once we send out the submission, the call out. So they're all very fresh and new writing.
Hi. Yeah, and that's interesting. The Mills and Boon had exactly the same model, didn't they? And they became so successful based on actual people writing about actual, real lives. I wanted to ask a question about nuance, because that seems to be a lot of what's being talked about. Nuance. This idea of women writers or women's stories being kind of curiosities because they're so unusual in the general canon or literary landscape, and how we get away from that and actually start talking about the content of people's writing. And I was at Bear Lit Festival a few weeks ago, and that came up in a totally different but sort of similar conversation about how do we get more different voices that are not white into the UK literary scene. And again, there came up nuance. How do we get more nuance? By having more stories, more different stories. And so I wanted to ask the whole panel, what do you think is the most effective way to have more women writers, more women perspectives just out there, so that we can start to get a more nuanced picture of literature written by women?
Well, I mean, sorry, should I start or not? I think, somebody has to take an initiative, and if we're talking about translation, it has to come from translators, I think. And this is where there's always this conflict between what you would ideally like to do and the actual realities of getting something published, because of the practical and financial aspects of this. And this is what I was trying to say about I mean, I can only talk from my own perspective, which is relatively limited. That by identifying those writers and then doing it, and once they've been lucky enough to find a publisher, then working. I mean, a lot of the publicity done by me, yeah? You have to promote your own books a lot of the time. You can't expect somebody else to do it. So, it's sort of writing about it in articles and, journals about translation, or on websites, and, promoting it by having events as well. Yeah, so, I mean,
I think if we want anything done, we have to create it ourselves. If women want to see more women writers, if black people want to see more black people, we have to be prepared to buy and support those writers and the books that have been created. Publishers will respond to the market. If they put out something and they know some people are going to buy, there's an audience, they'll probably create more. But because people sometimes feel they are publishing into a vacuum, they end up going for the old, traditional, tried and tested method or books. And I think that if we if we help to build an audience who's going to be interested in what we publish, then I think that's a way you expand what's out there in the world. And the issue of nuance is the more you have, the more nuance you will get, and you will also be able to have more to pick from, right? At the moment, we simply don't have enough. We don't have enough from different languages. Because when you have a book like this, like Panty, translated into English, for example, it's going to challenge how we relate to the English language itself, because we're translating from one linguistic group to another, and so our English gets expanded because it's been interceded with another language, right? So the English language gets richer, right? And I think of every time we, at least in Nigeria, some of the Nigerian languages, where we don't publish in Nigerian languages, what we're doing is enriching the English language, and in many ways impoverishing our own language, because we're not translating back. We're not bringing the poetry and the musicality of English back into Yoruba to expand Yoruba even further. English just gets bigger and bigger and more richer because of these guys who are translating from Korea or Polish, right? And I think it's when English audience, when we don't buy translations, we are limiting our capacity for expansion of our language, of how we use words. You know, when you were reading, both of you can hear other languages intruding on one level, but it's just bubbling in a very beautiful and poetic way. And that's what translation does.
Yeah. This is very interesting. Can I just say one thing that I'm personally very interested in is writers and translators who use English, or any language for that matter, who are not native users of that language. And Danny Han had a discussion with Elif Shafak and Alexander Hammond, I think last year at the Edinburgh Festival, about writing in English when you're not a native English speaker. And Alexander Hammond spoke precisely about this, about the fact that he realizes that his writing in English has this kind of transformative power on English itself, and is kind of this disruptive presence. And he was citing a situation where he gave a draft of his writing to a friend, and she said, this isn't how you say it in English. And he said, well, now it is. Because he made it so, because this is what he speaks of as his agency within English, this power to enrich, to disrupt, to create, to mutilate, whatever it is that he wants. He kind of takes that right for himself.
Well, there's a book to recommend is by Patina Gappa called The Book of Memory, which has been longlisted for the Bailey Prize. It's a book written in English, but you feel you're inside Shona. This is just a wonderful, beautiful, gorgeous way of being inside English language, as well as Shona. I highly recommend The Book of Memory.
Okay, thank you. Deborah, new ones?
Yes, I mean, again, it is the idea of range, of having just a range. It's not that there is any particular story or way of telling a story that is more important or more authentic than any other. It's just that when you have that one narrative, particularly about a certain place or a group, then you need to go beyond that. And on the one hand, I do feel, a little bit as though I wish not me, who was going to be publishing 5 books a year, but somebody who's publishing 100 books a year would have the same kind of idea, because that, you know, you could really make so much more of a change, it seems. But then on the other hand, I think, you know, what I want to do is be very careful about the kinds of books we're publishing. You know, you have to think about representation, even if you wish you didn't have to. And to publish things that feel new, that, you know, that there's the sense that this wasn't available in English already, because otherwise why are you publishing it? And new in terms of narrative, but also in terms of its aesthetics. And if you do it well enough, then small publishers, you know, are the ones who can sometimes take risks on behalf of larger publishers, and if something takes off, then maybe somebody else will sit up and take notice.
Nikki?
Hi, I'm Nikki Smalley and I'm from Under the Stories, and just speaking about Kamala Shamsi's kind of call to publish only women for a year. We're doing that in 2018 as a direct result of her provocation, as she called it. But I'm quite interested in the idea of how a single act, a single short-term act, can kind of have a long-term lasting impact. And what you just said, Deborah, about how it shouldn't be, I mean, it's fine for a small independent publisher who publishes kind of 5 or 10 books a year to do this. That's relatively, you know, for us it's relatively easy to say, okay, that's it, we're going to do that in 2018. And hopefully in doing that, certainly in doing that, we will kind of bring in a range of voices that we wouldn't have published in 2018 otherwise. But like that kind of bringing in that kind of accessibility, or like opening access in that way for a larger publisher, I think it's really important that that happens, and I really want to see that happening. I feel like it's a very difficult practical thing to do, and like that, I mean, that would make the significance of it like 1,000 times more valuable, or 1,000 times more. I just wonder if you have any ideas for the major publishers who are all sitting here listening to this discussion. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just putting that on you.
I have ideas for major publishers who ring me up all the time and ask about how they should publish more excitingly.
I guess like I think that this discussion is so important, and it's been being had, you know, on quite a broad scale in small forums like this, you know, where there's like 30 people maybe, but like for the work that we're all kind of trying to do to like have an impact, you need to have like 100 people in this room, and there need to be the people who are. Yeah. I mean, it's like,
Don't you think that it all adds up? I mean, it must,
I
you
think
know,
that
all
it
those...
adds up, but then the thing that you're thinking is that it would add up so much quicker if somebody with so many more books on their list and with such fantastically larger amounts of money were to do it. I think one of the things possibly is changing the way you go about finding books, because it's very easy for publishers to say, or for prize judges to say, well, we just didn't get as many submissions by women or from translations or by authors of colour as we did otherwise. And that will continue to be the case if people keep going down the same routes that they have, which is, you know, not looking beyond international agents, you know, the stuff that gets sent to them, recommendations by authors they already publish who will recommend more likely people who are like them and who they have already come across, which is another, great thing that And Other Stories Year of Doing Women will do. Suddenly you will have so many more women writers, on your list who will be able to hopefully recommend other great women writers that you should publish. And listening to translators, a lot of translators are, like Ursula, very aware of who they are choosing to translate and why. And not at all that this would be, less of a, commercial prospect than anything else, but that it would be doing something extra, something representational as well. And that is one way that really doesn't require that much more effort than it does to go to a book fair and look through submissions that some agents have sent you.
Well, I think you all have quite a few things to add to your action plan of taking over the world. And I think we should discuss this further over drinks in the hall. Thank you very much for coming. Join me in thanking the amazing panelists, Ursula Phillips, Bibi Bakare-Yusuf, and Deborah Smith. And thank you for coming.
Thank you.